I have now lost all respect for the American Girl brand.
Do not ever buy Mackenzie-Childs. The business was stolen from the original artist.
American Girl dolls are facing a strong backlash after their founders left an elderly couple penniless.
They lost all control of their company in 2001 and lost everything.
American Girl dolls is evil?
Founder of the luxury brand, Victoria Mackenzie-Childs, has died at the age of 77.
I'm so glad to meet you. My name is Victoria, and this is our very first video with you. We are coming out to meet you, the whole world.
How could a simple checkered teapot cause a lifetime of agony for the couple who dedicated their lives to creating it? And who's to blame for what happened to them in the end? Victoria Mackenzie-Childs, founder of the iconic 90s homeware brand Mackenzie-Childs, recently passed away. She was a beloved person by fans of her namesake brand, and with her passing came a litany of accusations of how her art, her name, and even her likeness were stolen from her at the peak of her career, which seemingly left her destitute at the end of her life. A viral video has been making the rounds that pinpointed the founder of the American Girl doll brand, Pleasant Rowland, as the culprit. The pitchforks came out, and now thousands of people are demanding answers from this woman who's largely been living in the shadows for the last 25 years. As a lifelong fan of the American Girl brand, I've actually heard rumblings about this before, so I figured it was time to start digging for answers. But once I scratched below the surface, I discovered a slew of half-truths and fairy tales, and before I knew it, I was deep into researching one of the most controversial religions in the entire world. When I first sat down to begin work on this episode, I had no idea what I was about to step into. What was originally supposed to be a 2 or 3 day long project ended up taking me well over a month because this got so complex that we had to spend days trying to figure out what actually happened. And I'm a little bit nervous to tell the story, to be honest, because the story you're going to hear today ended up being so completely different to what everyone's believed to be true this entire time. But I felt like it was important to tell this story. The whole story. Are you ready for it? I'm Jonathan, and this is Mackenzie-Childs' Checkered Past. Mackenzie-Childs is a luxury ceramics and home decor brand that became known for its whimsical style and handmade craftsmanship throughout the 80s and 90s. You might be familiar with their iconic hand-painted checkerboard pattern known as Courtly Check, which became a household staple by the late 90s. Mackenzie-Childs was founded in 1983 by husband and wife duo Victoria and Richard Mackenzie-Childs and is still running strong today. Victoria Mackenzie was born in San Francisco in 1948, but moved to Madison, Indiana in 1960 when her dad got a job there as a sales manager. She had been interested in art from a very young age and reportedly won a blue ribbon in 4-H for her ceramics when she was just a teenager. She attended Madison Consolidated High School, then moved with her family to Indianapolis in 1966 to attend Indiana University, where she would earn her Bachelor of Fine Arts in 1970. After graduation, she entered grad school at Harvard Radcliffe, but after learning that pottery legend Wayne Higby was entering the world of teaching at the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University, she switched schools in an effort to become one of his students. As fate would have it, Higby would not only become her professor, but he would ultimately take Victoria under his wing and personally mentor her. It was also at Alfred University where Victoria would meet her future husband, Richard Childs, who was also pursuing a graduate degree in ceramics. After completing their degrees, Victoria and Richard moved to Stoke Gabriel in Devon, England, where they worked for a small pottery store for about 2 years. During this time, Richard began his teaching career at South Devon College. By 1983, the couple would find themselves opening their first pottery studio in Aurora, New York. This location will become very important later, but the story goes that their daughter Heather was studying ballet in England while they were living in New York, and in order to help pay for her return trip, they started selling pottery. Most of their work up until then would have been considered fine art sculpture, and according to Victoria herself, making everyday items that people would use in their homes was looked down upon by their peers. Fine art was respected, but crafts were for peons.
We just got our master's degrees in sculpture, and it was very much looked down upon for people to be craftsmen in that atmosphere. fine arts and, fancy galleries in New York was everybody's goal.
Selling home goods was compromising their artistic values and risking their reputations as artists. They thought of it kind of like if Leonardo da Vinci had stooped so low as to make TJ Maxx wall art slop just to pay some bills. But Victoria didn't accept that. She knew that she could make pottery that was just as inspiring and complex as any piece of sculpture in an art gallery. Starting a pottery company really was Victoria's idea, and it was just her project in the beginning. Richard was still teaching and was apparently just sort of lukewarm on the idea. So, from the comfort of her own home, Victoria began making pottery. She described the process as liberating. Once things began to pick up, Richard joined Victoria's efforts and they began operating under the name Victoria and Richard Mackenzie-Childs Limited, which they would later just shorten to Mackenzie-Childs. Their style of pottery, I believe, would be classified as Majolica, which, to my understanding, is high gloss and whimsical with nature-inspired patterns and motifs. You know, stuff that your elementary art school teacher might collect if she won the lottery. Their ceramics were high-end and expensive, and they soon became status symbols, kind of like a Louis Vuitton handbag for your kitchen. Their early work included a lot of expressive florals and illustrative brushwork in the glazing. They used a lot of pastel colors, and it was very hand-painted looking.
I made lots of them, and every one was a different pattern. And at first I had no intention of ever making the same pattern twice.
Not typically what you would expect of your grandmother's fine china. It was modern and fun. Like any other company, they started with a hope and a dream by operating out of their home in Aurora, but soon they outgrew their space and moved into a small studio in Walcourt Hall. Now, Walcourt Hall was originally built in 1909 as a dormitory for Miss Goldsmith's School for Girls, which was a prep school in Aurora. But after the school closed in 1928, it ultimately ended up being gifted to Wells College, which was an all-women's university at the time. And it was continued to be used as a dormitory until 1974, but ultimately it ended up in the hands of Mackenzie-Childs. I know all of this seems a little superfluous, but it will be important later, I promise. So just remember, Wells College, Aurora, New York. Mackenzie-Childs would go on to experience enormous growth throughout the 90s, and the demand was hard to contain. With the debut of their enamelware line, Camp Mackenzie-Childs, in the early 90s, they began outsourcing some of their manufacturing to Taiwan because no one in the US could manufacture enamelware. Mackenzie-Childs was officially a global operation. In 1995, they introduced their now iconic courtly check pattern, which became synonymous with their brand identity. Fun fact, it was originally called roasted marshmallow because of the warm creams and caramel colors that were hand brushed throughout the pattern. Courtly check has stood the test of time and can still be purchased on a wide range of products to this day, including ceramics, home decor, personal accessories, and even furniture. People often compare their signature style to the Mad Hatter's Tea Party in Alice in Wonderland, and people were mad for Mackenzie-Childs. Their ceramics were so popular that they even became collector's items. In fact, their signature style kind of became its own genre of interior design in the 90s. It was formal and pretty, but it was also really playful. It was sort of adjacent to Memphis style that was really popular in the 80s and 90s, but it had a regal aesthetic to it because of the patterns and color palette. Mackenzie-Childs' style is kind of like Marie Antoinette meets Pee-wee's Playhouse. However you want to describe it, it definitely had a cult following. And rightly so. The Mackenzie-Childs products are beautiful and have been since day one. It's been a long time since I've seen them in person, but I remember how high quality they felt. They really had a handmade feel to them, right down to the glazing. I love how graphic they are, and my favorite thing about Mackenzie-Childs is how chaotic and mismatched everything is, but it somehow just works. Like, on paper, it sounds super ugly, but their style is so confidently discordant that it's kind of cool. I mean, hello, who else do you know that would put socks on the feet of a bookcase? In the 90s, business was booming. They had hundreds of employees and a never-ending catalog of new products, so Victoria and Richard were looking to continue expanding their empire. But once they increased their overseas manufacturing, they began to raise their prices. And not by just a little bit. We're talking price increases by as much as 50% in some cases. Mackenzie-Childs were expanding at a rate that seemed like it was not under control. And with explosive growth, comes explosive spending. By the late 90s, there were reports that well over 300 people were employed by Mackenzie-Childs. That's almost half of the entire population of the town of Aurora where they were based. Yeah, that's right, there were only about 700 people living in Aurora at the time, which is a really important thing to remember. Their operations got so big that they outgrew multiple workspaces to the point where they just ended up buying a gigantic old dairy farm in Aurora just to run their business out of. By now, you could find their products in high-end shops all over the world, and stores like Neiman Marcus and Bergdorf Goodman created self-contained shopping experiences for Mackenzie-Childs right inside their stores. And as business continued to thrive, Mackenzie-Childs opened a flagship store on Madison Avenue in New York City. Business was absolutely roaring for Mackenzie-Childs by the late 90s, and as sales increased, their spending increased. They made the decision to completely renovate their New York store on Madison Avenue, and at the same time, they decided to open yet another bougie store on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, California. To say that these retail shops were ambitious would be the understatement of the century. We're talking no expenses spared. I even remember reading something about an in-store rock climbing wall, but instead of rocks, it was like teacups. These build-outs were some of the most ambitious, complex, and expensive endeavors you would see from a business this size. Both of these new locations were in leased buildings, and according to reports, they were long-term leases. Based on my own experience, I would say they were likely 10-year contracts. God only knows what the rent was. And as their build-outs continued to suffer delays due to the complex problem-solving of things like, I don't know, teacup rocks, Victoria and Richard were beginning to spiral into debt quite quickly. $15.3 million to be exact. Oucha magoucha. So, how does that even happen? It's actually not as difficult as you might think. Mackenzie-Childs was a large company with multiple working parts, and everybody had their own responsibilities. Victoria, by her own admission, wasn't a numbers person. She and Richard were the creative visionaries of the company, and like most right-brained people, they didn't want to get involved in the numbers. And I get it, I'm that way too. A creative visionary. That's why they ended up hiring a CFO to handle the finances of the company. And because Mackenzie-Childs is a privately owned company, we'll never really know who was responsible for what, but as a general rule, if you're the owner or the CEO of a company, it is your responsibility to make sure everybody is doing their job correctly, because at the end of the day, all of the consequences of their decisions fall back on you as the owner of the company. It was actually quite helpful that Victoria became a YouTuber in 2020. So we do have a lot of firsthand accounts of how she interpreted the events that would ultimately lead to a resolution that, let's just say, didn't work in her favor. But in researching this episode, I actually started to get a really good sense of who Victoria was. And in many ways, Victoria sort of became the focus of this whole story. She's adored by so many people, and the whimsical nature of her art certainly was an extension of her personality. And as I kept digging further and further into Victoria's psyche, I kept landing on contradictions that sometimes were so jarring that I would go down hours-long rabbit holes just to be absolutely sure that I didn't misinterpret something she said. This actually all started when I was binge-watching her YouTube channel, and at the end of one of her playlists was a Fox News segment with Tucker Carlson. And I was like, wait, what? I think that was an accident on her part, but as I continued to look through Victoria's content, I stumbled upon her Facebook profile, and that's when I found out that Victoria was deeply entrenched into the Church of Christian Science and was a huge supporter of Donald Trump, which I gotta say, caught me off guard. It's not every day that you see a rainbow-haired artist frolicking through meadows and talking about loving thy neighbor, but also follows PragerU and Candace Owens on Facebook. It was actually quite interesting learning about Victoria. At least on the surface, her content was about promoting love and acceptance and not holding grudges. But then she would randomly say something so batshit crazy that I had to rewatch it 5 times because I thought, surely she didn't just say that.
That's what's happened to our government. That's why it's
a muck, and so we're very grateful for the honesty and the stability that's being established now. There are no segments of society that are in suppression or are suppressors. It's actually not true. But I think what's really fun about it and really helpful to get out of the belief of victimhood, which is a big controlling influence in society today. She changed the world. She brought all these legal immigrants to America. Legal immigrants.
Oh, no, she didn't. And look, I'm bringing up the Republican Christian Science thing because it was fundamental to who Victoria and Richard were, and it really shapes how all of this ended up unfolding. And it's also a big reason that there's so much ambiguity in the story surrounding the fallout of Mackenzie-Childs. And it was really hard for me to be unbiased in making today's episode, I'll just be perfectly honest, because I had to constantly keep myself in check so that I wasn't using confirmation bias as a tool to piece all of this together. But it was really difficult. Christian Science has some pretty messed up beliefs, including refusing all medical treatment, even for children. And kids have died from treatable diseases, including cancer, because of Christian Science beliefs. And that's something that kids just can't give consent to. And I think she and Richard being lifelong Republicans is a key piece of information because you wouldn't know it by looking at them. And a lot of the issues that plague them that we're talking about today are actually things that stem from overly capitalist cultures. And Republicans love capitalism. So it's important to know that Victoria and Richard were Fox News people underneath it all, and they actively helped shape an American culture that values profits over fairness. And of course, that's not to say I hate Victoria or revel in what ended up happening to her. In fact, I think getting to know her through the screen kind of made me sympathetic towards her. And it reminded me that sometimes it can be important to try and understand where someone is coming from, even if their approach is super misguided. But it seems like Victoria wanted people to be happy and live their best lives, even though you wouldn't know it from looking at her Facebook profile. But anyway, Christian Science was a huge part of Victoria and Richard's lives, and it informed most of their decisions, including how they chose to run their business. Which is why I decided it was important to mention today, because this whole situation makes a lot more sense when you know that. One of the things that kept coming up in Victoria's videos is that Christian Scientists are very big into the metaphysical and not so much the tangible. To kind of crudely put it, they think that we're all spirits and that everything else is not real. It's kind of a convenient excuse to not take accountability for anything. They pretty much rely exclusively on prayer to fix their problems, and I think that's how this whole thing got so out of hand. So Victoria was often referencing her thoughts and talking about things in a very loose spiritual way. She would constantly say things like, and I'm paraphrasing, she didn't like harsh and serious things. And typical things that religious people say, like God has a plan and things will work themselves out. Basically stuff that would lead me to believe that if someone was like, hey Victoria, you're over $15 million in debt, I feel like she would just say, okay, anyway, so I have this really great idea for a rock climbing wall. Again, she's not here to defend herself, and I'm kind of extrapolating, so I don't want this to sound like I'm trying to belittle her for not wanting to be involved in her company's finances. Victoria was constantly saying that she couldn't even tell you numbers in terms of things like number of employees, sales, the dates things happened, stuff like that. She even said she couldn't even remember her own daughter's birthday. Anything involving numbers and dates just wasn't her cup of tea, so to speak. And I think she and Richard gave full reins of the company finances to somebody else because they thought he would just do a better job. I have no idea how much it was conveyed to them that their debt was spiraling so quickly and how big the number was, but considering it was to the tune of over $15 million, I would imagine it was at least mentioned once or twice. But according to Victoria on her YouTube channel, she blames the banks for lending Mackenzie-Childs too much money, and that's why the debt got so bad so quickly. She's only ever said good things about their old CFO and most of the other people that they worked with all those years. In fact, the only enemy that she has ever named is the bank. I just think that Victoria and Richard were super naive in general, and This was their first time running a business, and probably their first time managing money in any serious way. I think they loved how popular their products were, but I think they viewed the business side of things as a gigantic burden that they actively tried to avoid. And I don't think they understood just how big the risk would be for borrowing $15 million without a solid plan to pay it off quickly. I think they just thought that with enough prayer, God would fix it for them. Hey, I thought I'd take a quick second to plug my Patreon because that's the only reason that this video even exists in the first place. I make all of my videos without the use of AI, so this video in particular took over 6 weeks to put together. I post multiple exclusive videos every month over on Patreon that are mostly about the American Girl brand, but as this channel is continuing to grow and expand, there's going to be a lot more cool stuff added to the Patreon throughout the year. In next week's exclusive video, we're going to be going a little bit deeper on my personal feelings towards Victoria and Richard and, who they were as people. As you can imagine, it's pretty subjective and personal, so I felt like it was a good thing to do for Patreon next week. I'm also going to be talking about the response to this video, so if any of you say some nasty stuff, expect me to see it. Anyway, that's all at patreon.com/idreamofjohnny. And while I have your attention, I would love it if you could hit the like button and maybe even leave a comment, because that kind of stuff really helps this video reach more people, and as a result, it'll help my channel grow. I'd really appreciate it. All right, that's all I'm gonna ask for. Back to the show. Alright, so this is where shit hits the fan, and no one's really been able to agree on exactly what happened. It's for a lot of reasons, but it's mainly because Victoria has told vague and varying versions of this story throughout the years. And actually, a lot of the things that the internet has documented as facts about this case can all be traced back to an old court document that was full of allegations by Victoria and Richard that were never actually proven as true. All of these statements were pulled from court documents from when, spoiler alert, Victoria and Richard tried to sue Pleasant Rowland and lost, which is why I think their story never quite added up. It was so messy trying to dig through this timeline that my partner actually had to join this project full time, and it took us days to figure out what actually happened. And even though there were a few things that we couldn't find definitive answers on, I think I have a pretty good idea of what actually went down at MacKenzie-Childs. And don't forget, they were employing somewhere around 300 to 400 people at this point. And I'd consider them to be the most vulnerable in this situation because they have the most to lose. Their ability to put food on the table and pay their bills was at risk. And Aurora was a really small town, basically a village, and I would imagine there was a lot of competition for new jobs. If over 300 people in a town that small were suddenly out of work, the entire town could collapse. Some of these employees had been with MacKenzie-Childs from the very start when they were hatching their original ideas in Victoria and Richard's home.
My name is Rebecca Proctor. I'm the creative director for MacKenzie-Childs.
I'm Rebecca Proctor. I'm the creative director and chief brand officer for MacKenzie-Childs, and I've been with the company since 1991.
My name is Tish Gibson. I'm the lead pottery decorator here at MacKenzie-Childs, and I have been here just about 29 years.
My name is Penny Morse. I'm the chief mold maker here at MacKenzie-Childs. I'll be here 28 years in June.
Suzanne Hogan. I'm a lead of cast, and I've been here for almost 34 years.
And because multiple people were involved right from the beginning, I would consider MacKenzie-Childs a collaborative effort. It wasn't just purely Victoria's ideas, and it certainly wasn't Victoria putting all the manual labor into making it all happen. And it can be kind of deceiving when someone uses their actual name as the company name, because it gives the impression that everything that the company makes was that singular person's idea, and that's almost never true. You think Walt Disney came back from the dead and drew up the entire Little Mermaid movie? Yeah, I didn't think so. Making products at MacKenzie-Childs scale requires a ton of collaboration and multiple people and working parts. And some of these team members at MacKenzie-Childs have spent decades of their lives pouring their hearts and soul into creating and developing the brand. Be sure to keep that in mind when I tell you how Victoria and Richard lost their company. So, it's the year 2000. We're in a pre-9/11 America, and people are equally optimistic and anxious about the future. Boy bands are dominating MTV, most houses have the internet now, Napster is sinking its claws into the music industry, and online shopping is becoming more and more common. It was a new millennium, and a whole new wave of technology has connected us like never before. Mackenzie-Childs now has a whole new world of market competition. Goods are becoming cheaper thanks to China now dominating the manufacturing space after years of building new infrastructure, and cheap home goods are readily available at the click of a mouse. The world of retail has completely reshaped since Mackenzie-Childs entered the market in 1983. Sales were declining due to competition and people's constant need for the next new trend. When you run a company as big as Mackenzie-Childs, expenses add up fast. Think of how much money it would take to make payroll for a company that size, plus purchasing inventory and monthly bills. We're talking expenses in the millions each month. That, coupled with the crippling expenses of delayed build-outs of new retail stores on the most expensive real estate in America, it doesn't take a mathematician to realize that this $15 million in debt could have potentially racked up in a matter of months. But it could have slowly happened over the years. We'll probably never know for sure. And on top of that, they were probably accruing a crap ton of interest on that loan, probably in the ballpark of a couple $100,000 per month just in interest payments. Their debt was so large and spiraling so quickly that they didn't really have a lot of time to figure out how to fix it. Or maybe they just thought it was a temporary setback and that maybe even a small brand refresh might fix everything. Or what I personally think is they were probably sitting around praying, hoping that things would get better without actually doing anything. But it's possible that the new retail shops on Madison Avenue and Rodeo Drive were an attempt to try and drum up business while things were slumping. But either way, they were on the hook for over $15 million and counting, and they weren't paying it back. I'd imagine the bank was panicking at this point. So, once a business loan is in default, which basically means that the person that borrowed the money isn't paying it back to the bank's satisfaction, the bank is allowed to get aggressive. They can seize assets, they can make demands for immediate payment, they can file legal action, and enforce personal guarantees. Stuff like that. With the Mackenzie-Childs empire at the brink of implosion, this is likely where they had to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This would have given them protection from the bank while they took time to reorganize their assets and make a plan to pay off the debt. It would also allow them to continue running their company during all of this while still owing all that money. But Victoria and Richard were super against this, even though it was in their best interest. And their main objection to Chapter 11 bankruptcy was that the bank, along with the local courts, actually installed a new CEO at Mackenzie-Childs. This is a very important piece of information. This means that Victoria and Richard were no longer calling the shots at Mackenzie-Childs. The new bank-appointed CEO was. Now, installing a new CEO isn't a requirement under Chapter 11 bankruptcy, but the fact that the bank moved so quickly to put in a new CEO gives me the impression that they didn't trust Richard and Victoria to be able to fix this problem and pay off the debt. And it's worth pointing out that their bank, BSB Bank and Trust, was not a big institutional bank. It's what most people would consider to be a local bank. It was based just in the next town over. In fact, they don't even exist anymore. Considering how small that bank was and how big Mackenzie-Childs' debt was, it was likely the first thing that came up in the morning meetings at the bank. I would imagine some of the executives were losing sleep over it, actually. It would certainly explain why they took control so quickly. Also, I'm not trying to go easy on banks, by the way. I've been screwed over by banks multiple times in my life, and I generally consider them evil, but I'm just trying to get in their mindset to try and make sense of why they did what they did. Whether their intentions were good or bad, this bank certainly didn't want hundreds of locals to lose their jobs. Either way, it is very clear that this was all against Victoria and Richard's wishes. Victoria always talked about an aggressive takeover of their business and how it was stolen, and I think the bank takeover is actually what she's talking about, not a particular person that everybody was saying that it was. I think that that's one of the biggest things that people have mischaracterized about this entire situation, possibly even Victoria herself. But it was the bank that took the company out from underneath Victoria and Richard. And again, they owed the bank $15 million and their business was collateral on that loan that they weren't paying off. I'm not saying what's right or wrong ethically, I'm just pointing out that that's how the world works. And Victoria and Richard would have known that before borrowing the money. Just saying. And obviously you can't just walk in the front doors of a business and steal it like it's some jewel heist. This was done legally and officially with a court-ordered injunction. Again, that's usually done when the person that borrowed the money is not cooperating and paying it back or coming up with a plan to. But anyway, the bank and the courts agreed that installing a new CEO at Mackenzie-Childs was their best shot at basically getting that loan paid off so that they could save the jobs of all their employees. So you would think that the next logical step would be for the new CEO to step in and start trimming the fat and picking apart expenses and working towards making Mackenzie-Childs profitable again. Because that's the whole point of Chapter 11 bankruptcy for any company. Based on one of Victoria's anecdotes, she and Richard were working on new licensing deals at this time, which in my opinion is a great way to maximize profits on an already established brand. Mackenzie-Childs can license the usage of their art and branding to other companies while also raking in a ton of cash with very minimal spending, because these other companies would be handling the cost of manufacturing and also managing sales. Victoria said they were actively working with Estee Lauder to design a perfume bottle, which actually seems like a great partnership. And by her own accounts, she was super excited about it. Licensing deals require not only another company to have faith in your brand, but also to think highly enough of it to attach their own name to it. And as a result, you can reach an entirely new customer base. Again, licensing would require very little cost to Mackenzie-Childs, and they could sit back and collect royalties off another company's sales. This is actually what the 80s and 90s sticker and stationery brand Lisa Frank did after their popularity declined at a similar point in time.
Now what we do is we do the artwork for a whole bunch of other companies who are then making it and shipping it.
They significantly downsized their manufacturing and sold their illustrations and branding to other companies as a means of cutting way down on overhead. That's actually how they still exist to this day. It was a proven business strategy, and I think it was a great one for Mackenzie-Childs to attempt. But their new CEO didn't think so. In fact, Victoria has even told the story of showing up at the Mackenzie-Childs headquarters and finding the Estee Lauder contract in the trash can. And that backs up my theory that the bank had no intentions of reinstalling Victoria and Richard as managers at Mackenzie-Childs. I think the bank just wanted to cut their losses and get their money back as soon as possible, and Victoria and Richard just stood in their way. I imagine that a simple Chapter 11 restructuring would have required millions of more dollars for the bank to invest in the company, and they just weren't willing to do that considering the uncertain landscape of retail at the turn of the new millennium. It's a risk that very few people would want to take, because you gotta remember that all of this was taking place right around the time of the dot-com bubble bursting in the early 2000s. So BSB Bank wasn't about to throw millions of more dollars at Mackenzie-Childs just to wait several more years for them to start turning a profit. It was way too risky. The odds certainly weren't in their favor. And as you can imagine, I feel like the bank probably didn't take Victoria seriously. I mean, considering she's one of the least pragmatic people you will ever meet. I'm sure the bank was looking at her thinking, oh God, we're screwed. I can almost guarantee you that they didn't take her seriously. And misogyny runs deep in this world, and it's possible that they didn't even give her a chance, which is really messed up. But at the same time, I kind of feel like she probably gave them good reason not to trust her. Again, just a personal opinion from someone who's watched hours of her content and theories and thoughts online. But regardless of how we got here, this is definitively where Victoria and Richard lost control of Mackenzie-Childs. Again, legally with probably good reason. And like I said, Victoria's accounts of what happened vary depending on how she felt that day. Sometimes she says the company was sold by the bank, and sometimes she says it was nefariously stolen. But regardless, a stable future for Mackenzie-Childs and all of its employees was the ideal outcome for this big-ass mess. And that's why the bank wanted to sell the company. They didn't think Richard and Victoria could fix it. But the bank had a major problem on its hands. The Mackenzie-Childs brand that they now had complete control over was worth far less than the money it owed, and no one wanted to buy it. The hole was too deep, and it would be really hard to climb out of it. It was a major liability that no one in their right mind wanted to touch, especially considering the US economy at the time. But Mackenzie-Childs was a part of the heart of Aurora, and it was a household staple for affluent baby boomers. It was not only a source of income for hundreds of locals, but it was an icon of the city. albeit a city that had been on the decline in recent years with closing businesses and dilapidated buildings, Aurora was actually struggling. Well, that's until someone who had recently come into hundreds of millions of dollars decided to ride into town and make things a little more pleasant. I feel like by now you probably know who I'm about to introduce, and that would be founder of American Girl dolls, Pleasant Rowland. American Girl is one of the most iconic and successful toy brands of all time, and it has a super rich history in its own right, a lot of which has been discussed in previous videos on this channel. But Pleasant Rowland was born in 1941 in Chicago and grew up in the suburbs just north of the city. After graduating from Wells College in Aurora, New York in 1962, she entered the workforce as an elementary school teacher. Also, she was randomly a news anchor on the side, and she eventually fell into the world of publishing in the early 70s after getting a job offer while she was on an assignment. Not long after, she would become a prominent children's educational author in the early 1980s. She developed the Addison Wesley Reading Program, which featured titles such as Adventures of the Super Kids and the Dictopedia. Her success in children's education in just a few short years led her to rack up $1.2 million in savings. While she was on vacation in Colonial Williamsburg with her husband in the mid-80s, she was inspired to create a doll line that would serve as an educational tool to teach young girls about history. With a $1 million personal investment, which was most of her savings by her mid-40s, she launched the American Girls Collection with her new company, Pleasant Company, in 1986. Pleasant Company was an immediate success, touting over $1 million in its first 4 months of business.
And when the season was over, Santa had come to us too. We had sales of over $1 million.
American Girl dolls became a household staple for the young girls and a few young boys that were lucky enough to scrounge up enough cash to buy one of their luxury quality dolls. They were almost $100 each at the time. The dolls were accompanied by historically accurate fiction books that would not only teach children about what life was like for young girls throughout different periods of history, but also serve as marketing tools for the very expensive dolls and accessories. And it was a catalog order only business for the most part. They didn't even use distributors or advertise on television. And they didn't do a lot of wholesale either. Most of their sales came through direct orders through the catalog. This was a pretty unconventional business model for selling toys at the time, and it required a really strong sales strategy, but it freaking worked. For 12 years, Pleasant Rowland self-funded the growth of her company without major loans or venture capital. Early sales grew to the tens of millions of dollars, and by the mid-90s, Pleasant Company was reporting over $100 million in annual sales. American Girl catapulted so deep into the American zeitgeist that it would not only become a household name, but it would also become a status symbol for the young kids that were able to get their hands on these dolls. These dolls were so coveted that I've heard so many stories of kids that saved up their allowance for months and sometimes even years, just so they could buy one American Girl doll, and it was their prized possession. An American Girl doll was the Birkin bag of children's toys in the 80s and 90s, and that caught the attention of toy mega giant Mattel. Originally positioned in the market as the anti-Barbie, American Girl quickly became the new standard of quality in the doll market. American Girl dolls were handmade by artisan doll makers in Germany. They weren't mass-produced at a low cost. By the late 90s, Barbie had become less of a high-quality doll and more of a cheaply made, mass-produced doll that was accessible to a lot more children. But that meant that a lot of corners had to be cut in order to keep up with the ever-changing landscape of toy manufacturing as it transitioned from key players in Hong Kong and Taiwan to China. But Mattel wanted that Birkin bag. And while American Girl was technically a competitor to Barbie, it was an entirely different experience. And it was a whole new market that Mattel could tap into. So Mattel approached Pleasant Rowland, who after 12 years in business managed to maintain 100% ownership of her company, and they offered to buy it. In 1998, a deal was finalized and Mattel purchased American Girl from Pleasant Rowland for over $700 million. I had to type so many friggin' zeros into the inflation calculator, but that's over $1.5 billion in today's money. Pleasant Rowland stayed on board for 2 years at the newly Mattel-owned American Girl to help smoothly transition ownership of the company. Then, in the year 2000, she was free from her dolls and absolutely rolling in cash and a lot of spare time. In the final years of her time at American Girl, Pleasant Rowland and her late husband Jerry Fauci began getting involved in philanthropic work. Many of their donations were to support the local arts in Illinois and Wisconsin where they lived. And we're talking donations totaling in the hundreds of millions of dollars. They had entire buildings built, and most of these donations were to organizations that were really personal to them. For instance, Pleasant Rowland received a kidney transplant in 2012, and years later would go on to donate $10 million to that same hospital to build a new transplant clinic. As I mentioned before, Pleasant Rowland attended the all-women's university, Wells College, in Aurora, New York, and you're probably starting to notice the connection here. She clearly had a grand old time in college because in 2001, she partnered with Wells College to form the Aurora Foundation, which essentially was a nonprofit that would take over management and renovations for buildings and businesses in Aurora. Pleasant had a love for all things historical, and Aurora had a rich history and a ton of super old buildings that needed rehab. One of the more notable ones being the Aurora Inn, which was originally a store built in 1833 that they turned into a super fancy, expensive hotel. But it's worth noting that not everyone in Aurora was on board with all of this. As it turns out, there was another nonprofit launched by locals of Aurora who sued Pleasant Rowland and the Aurora Foundation to try and get them to cease operations.
Rowland had words of inspiration for the class of 2014, but she stopped giving interviews. She's still smarting a bit from the lawsuits and protests by some of the locals. She announced plans to transform the village. That was in 2001, when Aurora's landmarks were in trouble. MacKenzie-Childs was in bankruptcy, and the Aurora Inn was condemned. Rowland bought MacKenzie-Childs and spent tens of millions of dollars renovating the inn and other historic homes and businesses.
I think they just didn't like the vision and felt like it wasn't preserving the history of Aurora enough. Y'all, I'm struggling trying to say the name Aurora like 10,000 times today.
Aurora. I just hate that name.
Aurora. But anyway, there was a lot of backlash from locals against Pleasant Rowland for basically turning the town into a luxury resort that relied too heavily upon tourism. And you gotta remember that outside of going to college there, Pleasant Rowland never actually lived in Aurora for a significant amount of time. But the lawsuit was thrown out, and Pleasant Rowland, along with the Aurora Foundation, ended up reviving about 15 buildings in town over the years. So Pleasant Rowland was heavily involved both physically and financially in the town of Aurora. And don't forget that it was a super small town with a population of around 700 people at the time. It bears repeating that half of the town was relying on MacKenzie-Childs for employment. You know, the company that was spiraling into bankruptcy and on the verge of collapse. It seems like sheer luck that Pleasant Rowland was currently tens of millions of dollars deep into looks-maxing the entire town of Aurora, right at the same time that MacKenzie-Childs was looking for a miracle, like basically to win the lottery. And by now, the bank had full control over MacKenzie-Childs and had determined that Victoria and Richard were not up to the task of being able to help get them out of debt, so what choice did they have other than to reach out to Miss Moneybags Rowland for help? She already had a proven track record of being able to sell super expensive stuff and lead a company's profits into the stratosphere. And not only that, she was handing out money to parts of Aurora like it was Halloween candy. Alright, I know that was a lot of information about Pleasant Rowland, but it's really important to understand how she entered the picture at MacKenzie-Childs. Most people making content about this situation online tend to paint this scenario as Pleasant Rowland being this evil supervillain rich woman that swooped in to take advantage of a vulnerable young artistic couple, but as you can see, that's really not what happened. It's important to note that after Pleasant Rowland sold American Girl to Mattel, she dedicated her life to philanthropy. And yeah, obviously making money was one of Pleasant Rowland's motivations in starting American Girl, but you gotta remember that her main goal in life was education and the preservation of history. It always had been. And also for context, if Pleasant Rowland had just parked her 700 million smackaroonies in the bank, she would have made well over $30 million a year just on interest for literally doing nothing. Her drive for doing everything she did was not to make money, but it was to help preserve and restore. Just keep all of that in mind with what happens next. Back at Mackenzie-Childs, the new bank-appointed CEO is making plans to sell the company, despite the objections of Richard and Victoria. But because Mackenzie-Childs as a company was worth far less than the debt it owed, it was pretty much impossible for them to find a buyer to take on the liability of shoveling tens of millions of more dollars potentially into a company that was essentially a sinking ship at this point. There was no guarantee that anybody could save the company. So this is the point where the bank reaches out to Pleasant Rowland to see if she would be interested in buying the company to try and help save it, because she has the reputation of being this super rich out-of-town woman that's throwing money around in the interest of trying to enliven the town of Aurora. And as a reminder, Victoria and Richard had already completely lost control at their company, so they couldn't make any of the decisions anymore, and it was the bank that reached out to Pleasant Rowland, not Richard and Victoria. And I can imagine their pitch to Pleasant Rowland included what would happen to the town of Aurora and all of the millions of dollars she'd invested into it if Mackenzie-Childs collapsed. It was very likely the town would collapse along with it. And Pleasant Rowland had already invested in the town's future. I cannot for the life of me find any information about the nature of the relationship between Pleasant Rowland and Victoria and Richard, other than the fact that, they sued her later on. But a lot of people have been making assumptions that they were friends, like Pleasant Rowland had befriended Victoria and Richard so that she could sneak in and take the business, but I can't find a single shred of evidence to prove that. I mean, it's possible, but it just doesn't make sense for the timeline, and knowing the characters of this story, it doesn't make sense that they would be friends either, just to be perfectly frank. And Victoria's retold this story a bunch of times throughout her YouTube career because people kept asking about it, but never once did she mention any friend or some sort of person that came in and sort of deceived them so that they could take the company out from under them. She pretty much every single time, in so many words, and sometimes directly, would name the banks specifically for coming in and taking the company from them. And even when Victoria speaks about this situation in really vague terms, saying things like, "We lost the company to a very powerful, unfair situation," who she is referring to is the bank, which was BSB Bank and Trust. She has never once mentioned Pleasant Rowland as somebody who stole the company from them. But either way, Pleasant Rowland agreed to take on the task of saving Mackenzie-Childs. I mean, of course she did. So from here, Pleasant Rowland and the new CEO came up with a plan for Pleasant Rowland to take ownership over the company. Again, not from Richard and Victoria, but from the bank. So, step number one was for Pleasant Rowland to buy the company's debt from the bank. There's no public record of this transaction, but I would imagine it was at a pretty decent discount, and that's pretty typical when somebody buys debt like that. This step removes the bank completely and allows Pleasant Rowland to take over full ownership of that debt and, as a result, the company Mackenzie-Childs. So now she has full management and can call all the shots. It is worth noting that Pleasant Rowland kept this new CEO on board as their new permanent manager, so it does kind of give some context to him being able to make good decisions, at least in my opinion. So he was the new permanent official CEO. Step number two was for him and Pleasant Rowland to approach the bankruptcy courts and get approval for her to purchase the assets of Mackenzie-Childs. These assets include things like the trademark of the name Mackenzie-Childs as a home goods company, their intellectual property like logos and product designs, their headquarters and manufacturing operations, their inventory, and any other property that the business owned. And they came up with a $5.5 million valuation for the total of all of these assets, which essentially means that Mackenzie-Childs as a company was worth $5.5 million at this time. And the third and final step was for Pleasant Rowland to form two new companies to carry out the court-approved purchase of all of these assets. So anything of value that was owned by Victoria and Richard's original original Mackenzie-Childs was pulled and transferred over to Pleasant Rowland's new companies. Think like Shang Tsung in Mortal Kombat 2 when he pulls the soul out of his opponent and basically leaves behind a bag of skin. Was that a weird reference? It's actually not as nefarious as it sounds. It's pretty common practice to do this because it allows the new owner of the business to sever any ties that the original business might have had. So for instance, if Pleasant Rowland no longer wanted to be committed to the leases on Rodeo Drive and Madison Avenue, she now had the opportunity to back out of those leases. So anyway, Pleasant Rowland has two new companies now. One of them she's named Mackenzie-Childs, and the other one she's named Mackenzie-Childs of New York. So these two new companies are now the official Mackenzie-Childs. And I'll just refer to both of these companies as Mackenzie-Childs from here on out, just so it doesn't get confusing. So now Pleasant Rowland essentially owns it all. Anything of value at Mackenzie-Childs, past, present, and future, belongs to her. So where does this leave Victoria and Richard? Essentially, they have an empty shell of a company with nothing in it. And they've lost the rights to use Mackenzie-Childs as a company name. They have no employees, no nothing. And because their company sold all of its assets for only about $5.5 million, they're still on the hook for $10 million because the original debt was over $15 million. It doesn't just go away. It's now owed to Pleasant Rowland because she bought the debt, but because she used some of that debt to purchase the assets, essentially, now basically Victoria and Richard owe Pleasant Rowland about $10 million. Does that make sense? So Pleasant Rowland buys Victoria and Richard's $15 million of debt. So now they owe Pleasant Rowland $15 million. But Pleasant Rowland wants all the Mackenzie-Childs assets, obviously, to continue running the company. So $5.5 million of this $15 million debt is used to purchase those assets to bring over here. So now Victoria and Richard only owe Pleasant Rowland about $10 million. Victoria and Richard still had all of their personal assets at this point, by the way. This includes the huge estate that they lived in and any cash that they had saved up and their 401ks, basically anything that they had collected over 20 years of running a wildly successful company. There's no way of knowing what that actual net worth was. I mean, it could have been in the millions, it could have been a lot less than that, but they still had it all at this point, at least as far as their personal assets go. Anyway, what happens next has been grossly misconstrued by so many people, and I'll get to why in a minute. But the story that's been circulating for years was that Pleasant Rowland bought Victoria and Richard's debt, and as soon as she got control of it, she called the loan on them, which forced them into bankruptcy. First of all, that makes no logical sense for her to do that. After a ton of digging and putting the pieces together, what I think happened was Victoria and Richard were removed from the company. I think this might have been one of the big reasons for Pleasant Rowland starting two new companies to absorb the assets, so she had the option of leaving Victoria and Richard behind. Because again, I think they were just viewed as a liability that was holding everybody back. And certainly they had a lot of creative differences. Victoria has even told the story of showing up at the premises at Mackenzie-Childs, and all of the employees were instructed to not follow any direction that she gave. So clearly she was attempting to overstep her bounds at the company. It was very clearly a bad situation. One other really important piece of information is that when Victoria and Richard were being removed from the company, Pleasant Rowland approached them and offered to clear their $10 million debt that they owed her in exchange for signing a non-compete agreement. This means that they wouldn't have to pay back any of the money that they owed in exchange for agreeing to not start another company that would directly compete with Mackenzie-Childs. With this deal, Victoria and Richard would be able to walk away completely debt-free and keep all of their personal assets. The only thing they had to do is not make the same product under the same name. This was quite a benevolent offer. Pleasant Rowland was basically giving them $10 million and absolving them from the guilt of running a company into the ground and having hundreds of people lose their jobs. Victoria even said that Pleasant Rowland told them that they would be free to pursue new endeavors, even like making ceramics. They just needed to not make something that was a direct competitor to the Mackenzie-Childs brand. Obviously, the point of all of this was Pleasant Rowland was trying to protect Mackenzie-Childs as a company and help pull it out of the hole it was in, so that it could become profitable again and she could save the jobs of hundreds of employees. I don't know what's going on with my hair today, but this one piece will not like stop sticking out really awkward. So sorry if it's annoying you, just know that it's annoying me 10 times as much. All right, anyway. She was concerned that Victoria and Richard would start a new company under the same name, making the same products, and that would completely cannibalize the actual official Mackenzie-Childs. And she was right to be concerned because, spoiler alert, that's exactly what they did. And this is where Victoria and Richard had the opportunity to completely walk away, absolved of all of their responsibilities and all of this debt that they racked up, and they could still go on and pursue their artistic endeavors. I mean, they were looking down their noses at the products they were making in the beginning. You would have thought they would have taken this golden opportunity to start making fine art again. And for most business owners in their situation, they lose everything despite working their asses off to try and fix it. My partner and I owned a party supply company for over 13 years, and when it went into a free fall during COVID, no one swooped in to save us. We ended up having to sell our house and our car just so that we could keep going and make payroll. Debt like this is often life-ruining, and it's certainly ruined my life for a while, and honestly, I'm still not completely over it, as you might be able to tell. We made it through, but it was really freaking hard. Victoria and Richard must have been completely delusional, or in denial, because they refused Pleasant Rowland's offer and chose Chapter 7 bankruptcy instead. It is beyond me why they would turn down this offer. This is literally like winning the lottery and tearing up the check. Refusing this offer meant that they could lose everything. So it's the early 2000s and Victoria and Richard are off dealing with the consequences of Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which I don't think ended up being that severe based on all of the things that we have evidence of them being able to keep. And just so you know, it's probably more than you and I have ever owned. There's evidence that it was not only a gigantic house, but also lots of cash assets. Back at Mackenzie-Childs, Pleasant Rowland has basically been spending her time building new infrastructure and polishing off the renovations on the new headquarters and essentially doing everything that she can to make Mackenzie-Childs become profitable again. And simultaneously, Victoria and Richard were looking to start a new life and a new company. It sounds like they were persona non grata in Aurora because this is when they moved into Manhattan and rented a small apartment. I think they wanted to get out of town. Through all of our research, we did find out that Victoria and Richard were allowed to keep their big home in Aurora, New York. They didn't lose it to the bankruptcy. So obviously they got to keep their home as one of the terms. And they didn't sell that house until almost exactly 10 years later, and I'll get to that in a second. But anyway, Victoria and Richard needed a new studio because their new living space in Manhattan was quite small, as most of them are. But according to Victoria, the only thing that they could afford in Manhattan was a boat. But it was a big boat. It's not like they were poor. This boat has a ton of lore in its own right, but in the interest of not losing the plot today, briefly, it was a 150-foot long, 4-level, 7-bedroom, 10,000 square foot ferry, which happened to be the last Ellis Island ferry in existence. Yeah, it wasn't a canoe. This would not have been a cheap boat, and I can only find rumors of how much they spent on it, so I'm not going to say numbers here, but it would have been to the tune of multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars that they paid for this boat. And they were fresh off bankruptcy proceedings, so if I had to guess, I would say they paid cash for this boat. The fact that they were able to make a commitment to not only buying this boat in the first place, but also commit to the ongoing maintenance and mooring cost of the boat means that they didn't come out of bankruptcy completely empty-handed. This would lead me to believe that Pleasant Rowland didn't exactly take them to the cleaners. And also, Victoria and Richard went on a TV show bragging about how they spent $500,000 on renovations on that boat. The boat was originally intended for them to run their new business out of, but it sounds like they were spending so much time there not only working but also renovating it that they ended up just moving into it. Again, most likely out of convenience because they did have an apartment in Manhattan and they owned a big house in Aurora still. This wasn't their only option in terms of living space, it's just what they wanted to do. Because Aurora is a few hours drive away from New York, it obviously wasn't feasible for them to drive back and forth every day, but they still kept that house. I have a feeling that they weren't allowed to sell that house without losing all of the money as part of their bankruptcy terms. Because often when you file for bankruptcy, you're allowed to keep your house if you're living in it, within reason. So they probably needed to establish that house in Aurora as their residence in order to keep it. Again, all of this is speculation on my part, but I kind of have a sneaking suspicion that they purchased a boat specifically as a loophole around not having two residences because the boat probably wasn't considered residential. So according to the paperwork, they only had one house. Because it is possible that if they purchased property to live in Manhattan, their house in Aurora might have been seized. And again, they sold that house in Aurora almost exactly 10 years after the bankruptcy proceedings were finalized, which leads me to believe that that was a 10-year term on that bankruptcy, and that explains why they waited so long to sell that house. That's just my guess, though, and I have zero evidence to back it up. So anyway, it's 2005 and Victoria and Richard have been living on this boat and working on new projects, and they are ready to launch a new business. So the next step was to register the trademarks for that business, which was called V&R Emprise, and they needed to register any relevant trademarks that they wanted to use. Those trademarks included not only their name, but also a logo with a Scottish thistle in it, which might look familiar. So when someone files for a trademark, that trademark is not automatically granted. It actually has to go through a waiting period called opposition, where other trademark holders that might have a similar trademark have the opportunity to file an opposition to stop that person from using the newly registered trademark because it's a conflict of interest. It's meant to prevent someone from registering a trademark for a company that already exists. This can happen by accident or it can happen maliciously. The reason I'm so familiar with this is because my partner and I actually had to sue someone for doing this to our business. They basically registered our company name so they could try and jump on marketplaces like Amazon and pretend to be us and steal business from us. We ended up having to sue them, and it was a gigantic headache that cost us thousands and thousands of dollars, and honestly, I kind of don't even want to think about it. This episode today was actually kind of triggering. But anyway, when Victoria and Richard's new trademark registrations entered the opposition period, obviously it caught the attention of management at MacKenzie-Childs. So it comes to their attention that Victoria and Richard have now placed registrations on MacKenzie-Childs and the use of a Scottish thistle in their logo, which is obviously a direct dupe of what MacKenzie-Childs is already doing and owns the rights to. So, as any company would do in this situation, MacKenzie-Childs sued Victoria and Richard for trademark infringement, because that's what it was. And yeah, I know it sucks to not be able to use your own name making the things that you've been making your whole life, but if my name was Jonathan McIntosh, I wouldn't exactly be able to start a computer company using my name. Just saying. Some people have tried to paint this trademark lawsuit against Victoria and Richard as some evil act, but really it's about as clear-cut as a trademark lawsuit can get. To me, this is just another example of Victoria and Richard showing complete disregard for anyone but themselves, and they were putting all of their old employees' jobs at risk by doing this. They clearly had it out for their old company. They could have literally done anything else, but they chose to directly attack their old company. There were multiple accounts of retail shops that were selling MacKenzie-Childs for years and years and years, and as soon as Victoria and Richard started their new company, Victoria started going around town basically flipping through her Rolodex of her old clients and was going into the shop saying, "Hey, we're actually the real MacKenzie-Childs, you should sell our products instead." They were trying to convince people that the original company was the one ripping off their work. And some of you may see some gray area there, but I personally don't. This wasn't just some squabble over who was allowed to use what name. Victoria and Richard, I think, actually wanted to take down their old company. The MacKenzie-Childs brand actually had to threaten to close wholesale accounts with certain stores because Victoria was in there trying to steal business out from under them. So with that in mind, and now that you have a better idea of who Victoria and Richard were as people, how do you think they handled the trademark lawsuit that was filed against them? Yeah, that's right. They countersued. This was right after Pleasant Rowland had just announced that after 5 years of hard work, the MacKenzie-Childs brand was finally profitable again. And don't forget that Pleasant Rowland offered to let Victoria and Richard walk away from $10 million in debt, scot-free. Get it? Scot-free? Like the Scottish thistle in the logo? Good job, Jonathan. That was a perfect metaphor. I kind of think that Pleasant Rowland was just over this whole thing at this point, including the pushback she was getting from locals in Aurora about all the restoration she was doing, so she decided to sell Mackenzie-Childs and move on. And her goal there was to make Mackenzie-Childs profitable again, not to hang around and collect a bunch of money, so mission accomplished. Lucky for Victoria and Richard, the new company that bought Mackenzie-Childs wasn't really interested in pursuing the trademark registration, and they basically chose to simplify it. It sounds like they just wanted this whole mess to be over and have Richard and Victoria out of their lives, because it was a huge distraction and was probably costing them a lot of money to fight it. So essentially they reduced the lawsuit down to call it whatever you want as long as it isn't literally Mackenzie-Childs. Ultimately, I think that was the right call because they did have a good understanding of how strong the Mackenzie-Childs brand actually was. But to be fair, Pleasant Rowland didn't have that luxury because the company was in such bad debt and not profitable. But by 2010, the court ruled in favor of Mackenzie-Childs as being the rightful owners of the name Mackenzie-Childs and dismissed all counterclaims that Victoria and Richard made along the way. By 2012, the final oppositions were withdrawn and everybody went their separate ways. And that's where the battle for Mackenzie-Childs that lasted over a decade finally ends. Victoria and Richard have nothing to do with the original company anymore, and since then they lived on a 10,000 square foot ferry running a new ceramics company. Victoria never lost her sense of whimsy, and whether it was ceramics or decorating a giant ferry, she and Richard lived their lives creating and inspiring people to live the best versions of their lives. And Mackenzie-Childs continues to enjoy success to this very day. Despite several ownership changes, their iconic homewares have endured the test of time and remain aspirational objects for people's homes. It's obvious that there's still bad blood between Richard and Victoria and their old company. They're not mentioned anywhere on the Mackenzie-Childs website. And Mackenzie-Childs never made a public statement after Victoria's passing. It sounds like there was never any reconciliation, and Victoria and Richard have had a bad reputation there for decades. With Richard's illness and Victoria's recent passing, they may no longer be creating works of art for people's homes, but their joy and whimsy continues to live on in their creations that they dedicated their lives to. And the people that worked alongside them to create Mackenzie-Childs continued to spend decades of their lives creating art and a culture that will probably outlive all of us. And it all started with a ballet lesson. So, what do I make of all of this? I think it's pretty obvious that Pleasant Rowland didn't do a malicious takeover of the Mackenzie-Childs brand as it has so sloppily been reported on all these years. It really is a lesson in looking at all of the facts and not just cherry-picking a few pieces of information and creating a completely false narrative. This whole thing created a villain out of someone who spent most of their life trying to educate and give back. And none of us are perfect and bat 1,000, and certainly there are some arguments that maybe Pleasant Rowland did hoard too much money, but the main arguments I've tried to make today weren't to make her out to be a perfect angel, it was just to present the facts of what actually happened. And I think it's really important to try and think about what her intentions actually were. And not only that, people have been calling for boycotts of the American Girl brand, which Pleasant Rowland hasn't even been involved in for over a quarter century. It's stupid. Pleasant Rowland just turned 85 when this story broke, and her husband had just passed away only a couple months prior. I hope with every fiber of my being that none of this shit made its way into her orbit, because it was super irresponsibly reported on. And as you can tell, she was extremely frustrated by a lot of the pushback that she got from the good things that she tried to do to help out communities. I think this kind of thing is the reason she hasn't really done any public interviews or made any public appearances since all this stuff happened. I guess no good deed goes unpunished. I understand that short-form content creators don't have the luxury of spending weeks putting together a story for a TikTok video that's only a minute long that they probably won't get paid that much money for. But if you are going to slander someone, I do think it's worth at least 30 minutes of research to make sure what you're saying is actually true. Every person that's regurgitated this story has made it sound like Victoria and Richard were broke, homeless, and living in a rowboat. None of which is even close to being true, and it's a huge mischaracterization of their circumstances. During the period that they were supposedly broke is when they bought that big-ass ferry and started a new company and lived in it. Again, it was 10,000 square feet, and they spent over $500,000 on it. And they had that really nice house in Aurora in addition to that, and they chose to live on the ferry. It was their choice. They weren't forced into that situation. And just as a reminder, they were fresh off bankruptcy, so I think they had hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash to go buy that thing. I don't think they would have been able to get a loan for something like that right after filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Everyone was looking for a villain when they heard a story that on the surface seems like it's one of the biggest injustices that could ever happen to a small artist. But Victoria and Richard were not small independent artists. They made the choice to build a gigantic company, which is a capitalist venture. And with capitalism, profits and logistics take priority over creative vision and individual people. But again, Victoria was a proud Republican, and this is the environment that she gleefully helped create and support. Because they chose to build Mackenzie-Childs into a huge for-profit business, it became a community of people that helped create it and as a result depended upon it to be able to pay their bills. It wasn't just Victoria and Richard doing everything. And it's extremely unfair to dismiss all of the people that built Mackenzie-Childs into what it became. Because by the year 2000, Victoria and Richard weren't contributing the lion's share of the work anymore. And yeah, Victoria did have the original idea and took the initiative to start the company, and that does deserve credit. But it's very clear that she and Richard were incapable of managing a company at that size, and if someone didn't take over, the whole thing was going to go down in flames and they would have lost it anyway. So Pleasant Rowland didn't come onto the scene trying to snip out an opportunity to take over a successful business because she liked the way their teapots looked. The bank reached out to her because she was their best shot at turning the ship around so it didn't drive into a gigantic iceberg, so to speak. Pleasant Rowland came to Aurora to fix broken things, and Mackenzie-Childs was one of those broken things that the entire town's success depended upon. The way I see it is Mackenzie-Childs was less of a business venture for Pleasant Rowland and more of a rehab project that folded into the rest of her work in the town of Aurora at large. If making money was her top priority, then Mackenzie-Childs would have been a stupid investment. She had more business sense than that. It was high risk and time consuming. And like I mentioned before, she would have gotten richer by just leaving her money in the bank to collect interest. And I know that doesn't mean that everyone agreed with her decisions. I mean, Victoria and Richard certainly didn't. But from my perspective, Pleasant Rowland's actions were well intended. And maybe not perfect, but Mackenzie-Childs is still thriving today, and that's gotta count for something. Just like she described when she created the American Girls collection, she wanted to honor the women that came before her that helped lift her up when she was younger. And that was her goal for the town of Aurora. She wanted to give back to the place that lifted her up when she was just a sprightly young woman attending college, hoping that she might change the world someday. This whole story really kind of became about Victoria because Mackenzie-Childs really was her essence, and getting to know her character through the screen made it very clear that her spirit was the heartbeat of Mackenzie-Childs. Her enthusiasm was infectious. After about 5 minutes of watching her talk about her love of ceramics, I started to wonder how much space a kiln would take up in my house. And it's not fair to paint her and Richard as helpless by defining their identities as people who suffered. Because the way I see it, they lived a pretty charmed existence. They spent almost their entire lives creating art and sharing it with millions of people, and as a result, spent most of their time being wealthy. They had opportunities that most of us will never be lucky enough to experience. And whenever she told this story, Victoria was constantly reminding people that she wasn't a victim, and she only ever seemed to talk about it when someone asked her about it. She didn't make it her whole personality. The Mackenzie-Childs Company was just one chapter in her life. And if nothing else, I think she wanted people to see her as a thoughtful person that skipped through life with as much joy and gratitude as she could muster, even when her health was in severe decline. And regardless of what you think of Victoria and who she was as a person, it's not accurate and it's not fair to project a life of sadness and misery onto her. When I look at Victoria, I see someone that's so wrapped up with creativity and spirituality that she could never be anchored down by something that ultimately wouldn't and couldn't change the course of her life. Her life was marked with contrast and contradictions, much like the checkerboard that became synonymous with her name. But throughout it all, she never wavered because this whole time, she knew that her art, Her stories and her spirit would leave a mark on this world that could never belong to anybody else.
If you love an idea, you cannot lose anything. There is no loss. And we wish no harm. We have no bitterness. In fact, we have liberty. We have love. And we just have a substance that is indestructible. And you needn't be worried for us. So, there we are. That's the beginning and the end of this great story and discovery together. So thanks for being here.